More people here than I thought it was going to be. It's my first time speaking in many, many years, so you'll have to excuse any nerves or anything. So I'm going to talk about the EU Cyber Resilience Act and its repercussions to open source. So my name's Nick. I work for a company called Cloudsmith. We are an artifact management platform in the software secure and supply chain space. I'm going to introduce you to the CRA. I imagine, bearing the fact that you guys are here today, you're already aware of this act, but I want to reintroduce a little bit about what it is. So the EU CRA, the European Union Cyber Resilience Act, is a new regulation that promises relatively stringent cybersecurity requirements for digital products. The idea is to boost resilience for digital products. It's going to bring to digital products and to software what GDPR brought to data protection. It wasn't solely the reaction to a specific event or a series event, but more a broader and more inevitable shift to enhance cybersecurity in an age where we have more ML, AI, more software. I think Mark from Canonical said there's 350,000 projects now in Git managed systems, and that's a lot of software. There's probably more that's not in Git or GitLab or another repository like it. There's been a couple of very high-profile incidents. The WannaCry ransomware attack in 2017, which exploited a vulnerability known Microsoft operating system as Eternal Blue, or the SolarWinds cyberattack in 2020 that exploited the build process across the software supply chain. It really just underscores that cybersecurity isn't going to go away. Regulation is coming. The initial draft of the CRA back in 2022 seemed to exempt non-commercial open source software from its scope. However, it was very difficult to define exactly what non-commercial was. It made everyone very, very nervous, as I think probably 90% of companies out there use open source software. I think for Cloudsmith, 90-ish% of the lines of code that we use are also open source libraries and public methods. So it's significant, and the threat vector you get from open source software and the software supply chain in general is quite large. Project maintainers are largely self-funded. We at Cloudsmith tell the story of Dennis Pushkarev, who maintains Core.js. If you've ever built a website using Babel, you will have used Core.js. It ensures backwards compatibility for different web browsers. In 2018, he was sent to jail for not being able to pay a fine when having a car accident. And it was not maintained for over a year. If someone had come along and maliciously tried to insert a vulnerability there, all these websites, 52%, I think, of the world's traffic goes through websites that have Core.js, could have been devastating. But the industry rallied, thanks to the advocacy and lobbying efforts of many organizations, including the Eclipse Foundation, Open Source Initiative, and our hosts, the Linux Foundation. As a community, the open source side really kind of narrowly avoided disaster. But in the immortal words of Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, don't panic. There was a fear, a fairly strong fear, that the potential liabilities for those project maintainers would stifle innovation in the market. With the burdensome kind of compliance requirements from the new regulation, there was fear that just European-based OSS maintainers may just disappear. Maybe not overnight, but over time, the more you are burdened by the responsibility of maintaining these things, like Dennis, the more it's probably less beneficial for you to kind of do it. Changes were made to the CRA, thankfully. The redraft was early this year. Fairly significant changes as well. It exempted, and it was extended to exempt what is now termed open source software stewards. which is any developer, any organization, any public repository which contributes. They're now exempted from being, I guess, regulated against by the CRA, but the software is still out there and we'll still use it, and it's still a threat vector. It now emphasizes increased collaboration between policymakers and the OSS communities, so really anyone in this room. It really has been kind of a backseat for the vast majority of the industry. You just kind of use it. You pull in packages from PyPy or JCenter or Canonical if you're distributing Linux. And so it's the purpose is now to make this more inclusive and make the community more impactful and effective in regulation. However, with anything and everything new, there's still a lot of uncertainties about how the change is implemented will be put into practice. It's still unknown today. If you've ever published a mobile application to the App Store, they have hundreds of guidelines, but none of them are rules. So the QA team have at will the ability to just say you don't align to a guideline. So there's lots for us to see around actually how all this will be implemented. Who's impacted? Show of hands, who's in finance? Financial services, offers digital products or services to finance. Do you operate in Europe? You're all impacted. Those who are not, obviously non-digital products, products already covered by existing standards like medical devices, the automotive industry, aviation, they're all very stringently regulated already. Custom software, anything you use internally that's not distributed to anyone externally, obviously is going to be exempt. Micro and small enterprises will also be exempt from the regulation or impact an obligation by the regulation. However, they're still going to have to be adhered to cybersecurity best practices. Again, kind of TBC on exactly what that is going to look like. However, any hardware with digital elements, that could be a smartphone, IoT devices, networking equipment, that's included. Software products, so OS, applications, embedded software, they're all included. Digital services, so pretty much anything you touch on your daily basis. I probably spend 3 or 4 hours on my phone a day looking at Slack and stuff. That's all included. You can read the slides as much as I can. The big thing for this is digital products in specific sectors, healthcare and financial services. Given the impact that a vulnerability has to consumers and businesses through finance, I suspect, and I think there's a lot of other kind of community leaders out there that are quite nervous about exactly what that's going to mean in terms of use of open source software. And there's probably I think there's 3 or 4 different talks today that look about how you go and secure the software supply chain. If you haven't signed up to those sessions, go there for sure. I'll be there too. The key features. A lot of these are not new to the industry. A lot of kind of innovative or fast-paced technology companies or services creators or product maintainers or kind of any industry within open source really are already very, very used to designing products securely. They're already used to vulnerability management, probably a little bit more passively than the CRA is going to impose. Knowing what vulnerabilities exist and putting PR to patch that into the backlog is probably not going to suffice anymore. Actively going and reducing vulnerabilities and threat vectors is going to be the aim of the game. You're going to be responsible for reporting on these things actively to the appropriate authorities. It won't be good enough just to fix it. It won't be good enough just to have a vulnerability exploited and remediate it. You will need to report it. You will also need to have documentation. Whenever like at Cloudsmith, whenever our ISO certification comes up for renewal, there's about 6 weeks worth of, holy crap, let's make sure we're compliant and auditable and all these things. it won't be reactionary anymore. It will have to be proactive. We'll have to prove that we are compliant with the cybersecurity policies. A piece that's not in the slide, but I guess things to call out. There are already kind of audit frameworks, things like FedRAMP, SOC, ISO, IEC. They're more around kind of auditability and confirming you have policies, you have internal kind of break checks. The EU CRA will be mandatory regulation, which is a different beast. So being able to formalize good security processes and practices is going to be very important. Automating security fixes, standardizing vulnerability reporting. Companies will be responsible for ensuring the security, including all open source components. Given, like I said at the start, 90% of companies use open source software. 90% of your code base is probably going to be open source as well. No one's re-implementing the maths features of Python. Any vulnerability and any vector where a threat could manifest, you're going to be responsible for. So yay for the project maintainers who are creating this for us all, but you're going to be responsible for it as service and product owners. So what should you prepare for? So this is probably going to come into effect around Q2 2027. I've already asked for kind of who kind of provides products and services. Anyone else who doesn't provide services, anyone else who isn't an open source, I assume that is none of you in here. Feel free to open your phones and play Angry Birds for the next few minutes. The next two slides are going to be important. Organizations that use open source software have to adopt secure development practices. That has to be implemented all the way at the product development lifecycle and software development lifecycle positions. It can't just be software in runtime where you see a vulnerability and you go and patch it. It's going to be all the way from the bottom. We don't know exactly what that's going to look like from the CRA, but these kind of design patterns will likely come into enforcement. There are probably kind of three kind of key elements to this. The first is kind of just adopting those best practices. More like over the last 6-9 months, we've seen more and more of these kind of come to light. Things like SALSA and S2C2F. Try to say those two things really, really fast, and I bet you can't. The things that the community or industry don't do a huge amount of as kind of private enterprises or public enterprises is actually go and collaborate with OSS maintainers. It's almost treated as like a free service. Once regulation hits and they're not responsible for the code they build, you are responsible for the code they build effectively. I would highly recommend you go and collaborate with those people, especially where you have critical dependencies. So I think within the Cloudsmith dependency tree, we have something like 1,400 first tier dependencies and thousands of transitive dependencies there. Assuming even a little bloating, that's a big job for us to go and ensure that each of those areas of threat are maintained and observed and monitored and remediated actively. The last part is to engage with policymakers. So there's already non-profit and NGO organizations like the Linux Foundation that lobby on behalf of the community. Get involved with those guys, especially if you're a big financial institution. If you're not already, and I imagine you are, go and speak to those guys as well and advocate on your own behalf. So we're coming up to time already, and thankfully I've mercifully done this on time. I've got 4 key takeaways. The start of the presentation, I promised to tell you what the repercussions of the RCA was on open source. And I think in general, it's going to have a profoundly positive impact, even though initially everyone kind of recoils and says regulation is bad. It probably isn't. It's going to hopefully foster more collaboration between policymakers and consumers and contributors of open source software. Kind of only with better collaboration can we kind of guard against those that are malicious or those that are just not great at code and leave memory leak vulnerabilities around. So take proactive measures to be part of the solution. Get involved. Cloudsmith is, if you don't in your company have someone that looks after open source, go and be that person, or go and find in your organization someone who does do that. The other three are really for the product and service owners. Regulation is coming, be prepared. If you're not already looking at frameworks like SALSA and S2C2F, if you don't know what they are, come and speak to me afterwards. There's 4 talks later today that will touch on these from Citibank and NatWest. It's important. They are probably the closest kind of measure that we have to the regulation that is going to come. The next piece is identify the impact to your product or service. Go and read the CRA. It's not very long. Use ChatGPT. It will summarize it for you. There's 3 classifications. There's default, class 1 and class 2. The class 2 is the most stringent, class 1's middle stringent, default's the least stringent. We're going to determine which one of those your product and service gets classified as. If you follow things like SALSA and S2CF, I'm not clairvoyant, but I can probably assume pretty strongly that those things are going to tend towards where regulation is, and they will reflect kind of the best framework for compliance. The last really is just get serious about kind of security by design. I hope this is not kind of blasphemy to say, but every time I see SecOps or DevSecOps, everyone kind of goes, oh, not those guys, Jesus. They always have these kind of like crazy asks, and they've got their own developers, and they submit PRs, and we don't have time to review it. Don't make it kind of a power struggle. Put it all the way in from the start. And that's it. Thanks for listening. If you've got questions, let me know. If on the slides, QR code. Cool. Question?
Yeah, thank you very much, and especially the call to action to get involved. I'm Pastor from Open Forum Europe. We are very involved in the CRA conversation and process.
Oh, awesome.
I wanted to add one thing.
Yep.
You're getting engaged with, because I would encourage everyone to have a conversation internally in your companies about take a look at this law, get engaged with the regulators. But there's one part, like the frameworks you mentioned, will technically not probably follow regulation per se. It will follow the harmonized standards through which you prove conformity. And those standards are being developed right now. So anyone, especially from larger companies, talk to your standards team to get engaged in this. Because the people that will sit in that room at Senelec, the standards organization, this is not recorded, I hope, they don't know all these things and the impact for open source. And they have 1,000 different things to care about. And open source is a tiny speck on the side, kind of for them.
Yeah.
But it isn't in the real world. So talk to your standards teams.
Yeah.
Sorry for...
No, please. I think it was good. Like, no one's going to give you a blueprint, but there's close enough kind of pathways and treasure maps there. Thank you.